How women were diagnosed as nymphomaniacs for enjoying making love. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, society held a dangerous contradiction in its hands. Women were expected to marry, bear children, and satisfy their husbands, but if they expressed too much enthusiasm for making love, they risked being labeled mentally ill. The term used was nymphomania, a diagnosis as vague as it was punitive. A woman's making love desire wasn't seen as natural or healthy, it was pathologized, and the consequences were often devastating. Doctors, husbands, and even fathers had the power to declare a woman a nymphomaniac based on behavior that today would be considered entirely normal. If she initiated intimacy, asked questions about making love, or even masturbated, it could be interpreted as evidence of an uncontrollable and dangerous urge. Her desire made her suspect. And the punishment? Forced celibacy, institutionalization, or even surgical intervention. Nymphomania was not a medical diagnosis rooted in science. It was a cultural judgment dressed in clinical language. It reflected a world that viewed male desire as powerful but expected, and female desire as unnatural and shameful. Medical textbooks described nymphomania as an erotic insanity, and treatments ranged from isolation to removal of the clitoris. Yes, clitoridectomy was considered a legitimate medical solution. In many cases, women were sent to asylums simply for refusing to suppress their making love desires. Married women who asked for making love too often, or who displeased their husbands, could be committed for being too lustful. Young women who discovered masturbation were labeled degenerates. Even widows who took lovers were seen as threats to moral order. Once institutionalized, many never escaped. Their medical records filled with vague references to lewd thoughts and unnatural appetites, they became prisoners of a label designed to erase them. One particularly harrowing case occurred in England in the 1870s, when a 23-year-old woman named Eliza was institutionalized after her mother caught her reading a romantic novel and claimed it caused her to touch herself. The doctor confirmed her excessive making love interest and declared her a danger to moral society. She spent the next 37 years in an asylum. In America, similar stories abound. In New York, a girl named Mary was institutionalized at age 16 for inappropriate flirtation. The doctors noted her inviting glances and diagnosed her as nymphomaniac, leading to a life inside padded walls. One of the most chilling aspects of the nymphomania diagnosis was how subjective it was. There were no physical tests, no scans, no objective measures. It was all based on perception, how a woman acted, what she said, what others assumed about her. Her fate could turn on a rumor, a look, a suspicion. And once labeled, she lost her voice. The diagnosis became her identity, and the system was designed not to heal, but to punish. This wasn't just about individual cases, it was a systemic control mechanism. Society feared female autonomy, especially making love autonomy. A woman who enjoyed making love too much was dangerous. She threatened the family unit, the church, the moral codes of the day. And so she was silenced, branded, caged under the guise of care. The language around nymphomania reinforced the idea that women were naturally passive, and any deviation from that norm was treated as pathology. This double standard meant that men could chase pleasure without question, while women had to walk a tightrope of chastity. Too little desire, and she was frigid. Too much, and she was a nymphomaniac. There was no middle ground, no room for authentic expression. The legacy of this injustice didn't fade overnight. Well into the 20th century, nymphomania appeared in psychiatric manuals, films, and courtrooms. Women accused of it faced social ruin, their character called into question, their credibility dismantled. Some were sterilized against their will, their futures decided by panels of men who believed that desire was disease. It wasn't until the women's liberation movement and advances in sexology that these notions began to be challenged. Pioneers like Dr. Mary Calderon, Alfred Kinsey, and Masters and Johnson helped reframe female making love desires as normal and diverse. They showed that desire was not a sign of madness but a fundamental part of human experience. But the scars of the past remain. Even today, remnants of the nymphomaniac label echo in how society judges women. Words like slut, promiscuous, and too much carry the same weight of condemnation. Women still walk a fine line, praised for being sexy but punished for wanting making love. The control has become more subtle, but it hasn't disappeared. It hides in school dress codes that shame girls for distracting boys. It echoes in courts that question a rape victim's clothing or history. It lingers in media that praises male conquest but vilifies female passion. The term nymphomaniac may have faded from clinical use, but its shadow remains long and heavy. The history of diagnosing women as nymphomaniacs isn't just a tale of bad medicine. It's a story about power, about who gets to define what is normal, about how science can be manipulated to serve social control. It's a reminder that the language of illness can become a weapon when used to police identity. This history must be remembered not as a curiosity, but as a warning, because whenever a society pathologizes the natural behaviors of a group, whether it's based on gender, race, or sexuality, it builds institutions not to help, but to suppress. And the cost is paid in lost voices, stolen freedom, and generations of shame that never belonged to the ones forced to carry it. Female masturbation was considered a cause of madness. What if your body's curiosity was once treated as a disease? For centuries, female sexuality was not only misunderstood, it was feared, pathologized, and brutally punished. In the eyes of many doctors and moralists from the 18th through early 20th centuries, a woman exploring her own body was not engaging in self-discovery. She was committing a dangerous act, an act that could allegedly trigger insanity, moral collapse, and physical decay. This isn't ancient superstition. This was mainstream science. This was medicine. The myth that masturbation caused madness has deep roots, but for women, it carried a specific kind of terror. In a world built around patriarchal control, female pleasure became a threat. A woman who understood her own body, who didn't rely on a husband to define her experience, was, to many, a dangerous anomaly. So instead of studying or respecting sexual health, male doctors condemned it. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the rise of moral medicine coincided with the Industrial Revolution and growing anxieties around purity, discipline, and control. Medical texts from this period described female masturbation as a gateway to mental deterioration. Doctors warned that touching oneself would cause hysteria, spinal decay, seizures, even death. And for girls or women caught in the act, the consequences were horrifying. Parents were instructed to monitor daughters constantly. Beds were fitted with alarms or restraining belts. At night, girls were tied down or placed in chastity harnesses made of metal or leather. Some physicians even advocated sewing, shut parts of a girl's clothing or hands into sleeves to prevent access to their bodies. In cases of extreme moral panic, they went further. They reached for the scalpel. Clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris, was proposed and performed in Western countries, particularly Britain and the United States, as a cure for female masturbation. Prominent physicians like Dr. Isaac Baker Brown claimed this mutilation would prevent insanity and restore moral behavior. Girls as young as 10 were subjected to these procedures without consent. Their only crime? Being sexual beings in a world that demanded their silence. These procedures were not hidden. They were published, celebrated, cited in medical journals. But this wasn't just about controlling pleasure, it was about enforcing submission. Female sexuality outside marriage was labeled pathological. If a woman expressed desire, she was sick. If she resisted sex in marriage, she was frigid. But if she sought pleasure alone, she was unstable. Either way, she was wrong. In Victorian asylums, masturbation was frequently cited as a cause of female madness. Women admitted for moral insanity often faced invasive inspections and degrading treatments. Some were forced into cold baths. Others were shocked with electricity or injected with chemical agents designed to suppress sexual function. Silence was not just expected, it was enforced with violence. The irony? These institutions never questioned male sexuality with the same fervor. Masturbation was criticized for boys, yes, but it was policed for girls. While boys were seen as rebellious or misdirected, girls were marked as corrupt, mentally broken, dangerous. The female body became both the crime scene and the accused. And yet, even amidst this horror, some resisted. By the early 20th century, as psychoanalysis and sexology began to emerge, voices like Havelock Ellis and Marie Stopes challenged the myths. They argued that female desire was natural, that masturbation wasn't madness, it was human. But the damage had been done. Generations of women grew up believing their bodies were shameful, that pleasure was punishment, that silence was safety, and those scars run deep. Medical textbooks in the 1800s were chilling in their certainty. One English physician wrote that unchecked self-abuse in women would result in idiocy, blindness, sterility, spinal curvature, and death. Some claimed it changed the very shape of the face. Pinched features and hollow cheeks were cited as signs of moral collapse. These weren't fringe beliefs, they were part of standard medical training. Churches amplified the message. Pastors warned that the soul itself could be corrupted through solitary acts. Girls in religious households were taught that even thinking about their own bodies invited demons. Some were forced to confess impure thoughts in public. Others were told their future as wives and mothers was ruined unless they repented and repressed. What began as misinformation turned into an industry. Restraint devices were marketed to parents as protective tools, metal mittens, locking belts, or electrified furniture that jolted the body awake if a child moved too much. These weren't medieval relics, they were advertised in 19th century catalogs and praised in parenting guides. In some hospitals, masturbation was listed on intake forms as a primary diagnosis. The underlying message was clear. A woman's body was not her own. It belonged to religion, to medicine, to marriage, to control. And the silence surrounding it was generational. Mothers raised to fear their own bodies passed that fear on to daughters. Decades later, even after science debunked the madness myth, shame lingered. It shaped education systems, relationships, and mental health care. It made conversations about consent, pleasure, or trauma almost impossible. And that silence bred isolation. But silence is beginning to crack. Today, more women are speaking openly about their experiences, reclaiming their right to understand and enjoy their own bodies. Sexual health is slowly shedding its stigma. Schools are beginning to adopt inclusive education. Advocates fight for representation, access, and honesty. But progress remains uneven. The past is never fully past. It lives on in whispers, laws, and cultural norms. To confront that history is not to dwell in it, but to break its spell. Because for centuries, women weren't just denied pleasure, they were denied humanity. They were mutilated not for misdeeds, but for desire. Institutionalized not for danger, but for disobedience. Labeled insane for doing what their male counterparts were expected to do without shame. And so, this history matters. It matters every time someone flinches at the word pleasure, every time shame silences a question, every time a woman's body is still treated like a threat instead of a truth. So remember this: autonomy is not insanity. Curiosity is not a crime. And the body, in all its sensation and silence, was never meant to be punished. It was meant to be lived in. And finally, it can be. The invention of hysteria as a female-only disease. What if madness was once blamed on a woman's womb? For thousands of years, hysteria wasn't just a word, it was a weapon. A medical myth. A historical injustice carved deep into the roots of Western medicine. The diagnosis of hysteria began in ancient Egypt and Greece when philosophers and physicians, overwhelmingly male, looked at women's pain, fear, desire, or even creativity and labeled it a sickness, a disorder. Not of the mind, they claimed, but of the uterus. Yes, the uterus itself was said to wander. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, believed that the womb could move freely within a woman's body. When it strayed too far, pressing against the diaphragm or the heart, it supposedly triggered panic, seizures, paralysis, or fits of irrationality. Plato and Aristotle echoed this belief, arguing that the female body was inherently unstable, passionate, dangerous. A woman who spoke too much, cried too often, or simply rejected societal norms might be accused of suffering from a wandering womb and prescribed marriage, pregnancy, or even perfumed fumigations to lure the uterus back to place. Not compassion, not therapy, not autonomy. By the time Roman doctors like Galen wrote their manuals, the idea had evolved. Hysteria was a physical illness caused by a retained female seed, a kind of sexual congestion. A woman who hadn't fulfilled her reproductive role, who didn't have enough sex with men, was deemed mentally and physically unwell. In short, if you weren't submissive, married, and fertile, something was wrong with you. For centuries, this belief infected Europe's medical thinking. In medieval times, hysteria merged with religious superstition. Women who trembled, wept, or defied their husbands might be diagnosed as witches, possessed. Clergy claimed the devil entered the body through the womb, driving women to sin and insanity. Exorcisms replaced medical care. Holy water replaced empathy. Thousands were burned, drowned, or mutilated, not because they were ill, but because they were misunderstood. The Renaissance brought some shifts in scientific thinking, but hysteria remained. Medical texts grew more elaborate, but their conclusions were the same. Women's bodies were threats to be controlled. The uterus was a mystery organ, blamed for everything that men couldn't or wouldn't understand. From fainting spells to melancholy, from menstrual cramps to sexual frustration, hysteria became a convenient label, one that silenced, shamed, and pathologized. And it didn't stop. In the 18th and 19th centuries, even as Enlightenment ideals began reshaping science and reason, hysteria endured, repackaged in new language. Male doctors, now wearing the coats of modern medicine, insisted hysteria was a nervous disorder tied exclusively to the female nervous system. Sigmund Freud famously theorized that repressed sexual trauma caused hysterical conversion, where emotional distress transformed into physical symptoms like blindness or paralysis. He listened to women, but only through the lens of male interpretation. Women's tears were still suspect, their resistance still criminal, their pain still sexualized. In Victorian England, the diagnosis of hysteria reached its peak. Women were prescribed isolation, electric shock therapy, and even surgical removal of their clitoris or ovaries. Why? Because their emotions didn't fit the mold, because grief was mistaken for madness, because trauma was interpreted as lust. In France, Jean-Martin Charcot displayed hysterical women in front of audiences, performing their symptoms like theater. These were not patients, they were exhibits, objects of fascination and control. Even into the 20th century, the legacy persisted. Hysteria became a catch-all diagnosis for women who challenged norms. Career ambition? Hysteria. Sexual autonomy? Hysteria. Postpartum depression? Hysteria. It was a silent spell disguised as science. And then came the pills. By the 1950s, pharmaceutical companies were marketing tranquilizers directly to housewives. Mother's little helper, they called them. Sedatives to smooth out your emotions, to keep you pleasant, to keep you quiet. A chemically induced calm that masked the deeper unrest of lives constrained by gender roles. It wasn't until the 1980s that hysteria was officially removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. But by then, the damage had been done. The echoes of the diagnosis remain. Today, women are still more likely to have their pain dismissed by doctors, more likely to be told it's all in their head, more likely to wait longer for diagnosis, treatment, or belief. And the word hysteria? It comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb, a word that turned female biology into a curse. That labeled women's suffering as delusion. That made generations of women doubt their own sanity simply because they dared to feel. This is not just a history of medicine. It's a history of power, of how pseudoscience was used to police half the population, and of how easily misunderstanding becomes oppression when cloaked in the language of expertise. So next time you hear the word hysterical, remember, it was never about health. It was about control. and history is watching how we use it next. The use of vibrators to cure hysteria were. Imagine a time when a woman's emotional outburst, sexual desire, or even simple dissatisfaction with life was not seen as a symptom of deeper psychological complexity, but as a medical disease. This was the age of hysteria, a now discredited diagnosis that once haunted the medical records of countless women across centuries. But hidden in this bizarre chapter of history lies something even more unbelievable: the invention of the vibrator, not for pleasure, but as a medical instrument. And its origin story is one of the most uncomfortable truths in the history of medicine. In the 19th century, hysteria was a catch-all diagnosis used to explain a wide range of symptoms in women, from anxiety, irritability, insomnia, nervousness, and sexual frustration to weeping spells and fainting. The term comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. Ancient physicians believed that the womb could literally wander inside a woman's body, wreaking havoc on her emotions and health. As absurd as that sounds today, this belief persisted for centuries, shaping how female bodies were misunderstood and mistreated. By the Victorian era, hysteria had become one of the most common medical diagnoses among women in Europe and North America. The list of symptoms was so broad and vague that nearly any woman could be labeled hysterical. But here's where the story takes a surreal turn. Physicians believed that the way to relieve hysteria was to induce what they called hysterical paroxysm, in modern terms, an orgasm. They didn't call it that, of course. Sexuality, particularly female pleasure, was taboo. These doctors saw themselves as healers of madness, not participants in sex. And so doctors, mostly male, began treating hysteria with pelvic massages. Yes, you heard that right. These trained physicians would manually stimulate their female patients' genitals until they experienced what was described as a release of tension. This process could take a long time and was labor-intensive, often lasting up to an hour or more. Some doctors complained of hand cramps. Others viewed it as an unfortunate burden. They believed it worked, though. Patients would often return calmer, happier, and reportedly cured. Enter the vibrator. In the late 1800s, British physician Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville invented an electromechanical device known as the percussor, intended originally for muscle aches. But it didn't take long for doctors to adapt it for pelvic massage. It quickly became a tool in the treatment of hysteria. These early vibrators were large, loud, and powered by batteries or steam engines. But they did the job faster and with less effort. By the early 20th century, vibrators had become commonplace in doctors' offices, even making their way into home medical catalogs as a legitimate therapeutic device. It's important to understand, in that time, the use of vibrators was not associated with sex or pleasure. It was marketed as a clinical device. Women, and often their doctors, were either unaware or willfully blind to the sexual nature of the act. The language of medicine obscured what was actually happening: mechanized orgasms performed under the guise of healing. And this continued for decades. Eventually, however, the world caught on. As the medical community grew more sophisticated and modern psychology emerged, the hysteria diagnosis began to collapse. Sigmund Freud, though problematic in his own right, played a role in this shift by redefining hysteria in psychological terms rather than physical ones. But even then, Freud's interpretations often reduced women to neurotic beings obsessed with unfulfilled sexual longing. By the 1920s and 30s, the vibrator's role in medicine began to fade. As its association with sexual pleasure became more openly acknowledged, it was pushed out of the clinical sphere and into the private realm. Eventually, vibrators would resurface during the sexual revolution as tools of liberation rather than control. Looking back, this story is a chilling reflection of how women's bodies and emotions were pathologized, misinterpreted, and quite literally handled by a male-dominated medical system. Female pleasure was so feared, so unspoken, that it had to be disguised as therapy. The irony is tragic. What could have been a journey into understanding women's needs became a history of suppression, disguised as science. The invention of the vibrator is not just a footnote in medical history. It's a symbol of how deeply society feared female sexuality and how science was used to control it. It reminds us that what is called treatment is not always care, and that what is labeled disease may be nothing more than misunderstanding, stigma, or even control. We cannot rewrite this strange chapter of history, but we can remember it for what it truly was, a testament to the dangerous power of pseudoscience, and a dark mirror reflecting the biases of its time. And perhaps in understanding it, we come a step closer to ensuring that future medicine serves not to silence women, but to finally listen. Forced institutionalization of women by husbands or fathers. In the dim and echoing halls of 19th century asylums, thousands of women disappeared from public view, not because they were violent or mentally ill, but because they challenged the fragile comfort of patriarchy. These were not isolated cases. This was a normalized, systematic abuse of institutional power that allowed fathers, brothers, and especially husbands to declare women mentally unfit and have them locked away indefinitely. Imagine being committed simply for being outspoken, for reading too many novels, for disagreeing with your husband about politics or religion, for refusing sex, for grieving the loss of a child longer than others deemed acceptable, for menstruating too loudly or even at the wrong time of the month. These reasons weren't rare. They were documented in countless asylum records, case files, and court testimonies across Europe and the United States. There was a time when a woman's freedom could be ended with nothing more than a man's signature. Once institutionalized, many women found themselves in a trap with no exit, no trial, no defense, no legal hearing. And once inside, almost anything they said or did was twisted into proof of madness. If they cried, it was hysteria. If they resisted treatment, it was defiance. If they begged for release, it was delusion. Every protest reinforced the diagnosis. The walls of the asylum didn't just hold their bodies, they buried their truths. The conditions inside these institutions were bleak, especially for women who weren't even ill to begin with. They were subjected to forced sedation, isolation, ice-cold baths, purging, blistering, and later in the 20th century, electroshock therapy. Speaking up or resisting these treatments only reinforced their diagnosis. They were mad because they cried out. They were insane because they wanted to leave. It was a circular trap of cruelty, a silence loop from which there was almost no escape. One of the most infamous examples was Elizabeth Packard, who was committed by her husband in 1860 because she disagreed with his rigid religious views. She wasn't violent or unstable. She was educated, articulate, and fiercely intelligent. But she was inconvenient. For 3 years, she lived in confinement, labeled a lunatic for the crime of having an independent mind. When she was finally released, she did what few women could. She told her story, campaigned for change, and helped reform laws regarding institutionalization. But how many more stories were never told? The structure of the asylum system itself was built to suppress female autonomy. In Victorian England and America, men could institutionalize a woman with alarming ease. A letter from a father, a complaint from a husband, even whispers from neighbors could become enough evidence for commitment. A nervous disposition, melancholy, or moral insanity became catch-all terms that disguised social control as medicine. Once committed, women lost their legal rights, their parental rights, and often any chance of appeal. Menstrual cycles, sexual appetites, childbirth trauma, these deeply biological, deeply human experiences were pathologized as signs of illness. The term hysteria, derived from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, became a sweeping diagnosis for any behavior that unsettled the male-defined norm. A woman too emotional, too cold, too interested in sex, or not interested at all could be labeled hysterical. The diagnosis told more about male fears than female reality. It was a condition of patriarchy, not physiology. Hospitals like the Bloomingdale Asylum in New York or the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known as Bedlam, housed thousands of women with diagnoses so vague they might as well have said inconvenient. In some cases, women were institutionalized to take control of property, silence political opinions, or erase embarrassment from the family name. These weren't always the poor or the powerless. Wealthy women, educated women, even titled women. No one was immune from the reach of forced commitment cloaked in medical authority. Even female sexuality was treated as pathology. Masturbation was cited in case notes as a symptom of madness. A young woman expressing romantic interest in the wrong man could be labeled promiscuous and sent away. Others were punished for refusing marriage proposals or resisting domestic life. The asylum became a tool of correction, a means of reshaping women back into roles the culture had deemed proper: silent, obedient, dependent. And yet, some of the most haunting tragedies were not the dramatic ones, but the quiet stories: the woman who wept for her lost child and never stopped, the girl who read philosophy and refused to smile, the widow who wore black for too long. They were put away not because they were dangerous, but because they reminded the world that women were human, fallible, intelligent, grieving, passionate, complex in a way society was not prepared to accept. This system began to slowly unravel only in the late 20th century as laws changed, as feminist movements exposed the cruelty, and as psychiatric medicine finally began separating diagnosis from dogma. But even now, the echoes of that era linger. Women's pain is still underestimated. Their voices are still dismissed. Mental health is still used, sometimes subtly, to undermine their autonomy. To speak of this history is not to dwell in victimhood, it is to confront the truth, to understand how power disguises itself, to remember the women who were silenced so that others might not be. Because when a society builds walls to hide its most inconvenient citizens, it reveals more about itself than those it locks away. In their memory, we ask questions that must never go quiet again. Who decides what is madness? Who gets to define sanity? And in whose interest is silence truly served? The rest cure that made women worse. In the late 19th century, a strange and disturbing form of psychiatric treatment swept through upper-class America and Europe, something known as the rest cure. Devised by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a highly influential American neurologist, the treatment was hailed as a breakthrough in mental health care, particularly for women suffering from what was then vaguely diagnosed as nervous exhaustion. But beneath its polished veneer of medical legitimacy, the rest cure became a silent prison for countless women. The theory behind the rest cure was deceptively simple. Mitchell believed that women, due to their fragile and emotional nature, were more susceptible to nervous disorders, what we might today call anxiety, depression, or postpartum conditions. His prescription was drastic: complete and total rest. Patients were confined to bed for 6 to 8 weeks or more, not permitted to lift a finger. They were banned from reading, forbidden to write, instructed not to think deeply. Any form of emotional stimulation was viewed as dangerous. In short, they were turned into passive bodies, stripped of their minds. What may sound like a retreat from daily pressures was in truth a psychological cage. Women subjected to this treatment were stripped of autonomy, treated as if they were too delicate to participate in the world. Their rooms became padded cells of silence. In place of companionship, they had solitude. Instead of therapy, they had endless hours staring at the walls. The medical establishment claimed it was a cure, but to the women enduring it, it felt like slow erasure. Dr. Mitchell, who had also treated Civil War soldiers with a more active regimen, believed that women's nervous systems were fundamentally different from men's. He asserted that female vitality was tied to their reproductive systems, and any deviation from normal behavior, be it ambition, assertiveness, or intellect, was viewed as a threat to their womanhood. Thus, the rest cure became a tool not just for medical intervention, but for social enforcement. It quieted the mind, yes, but only by suppressing the spirit. One of the most devastating outcomes of the rest cure is immortalized in literature. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and social reformer, was prescribed the rest cure by Dr. Mitchell after suffering postpartum depression. She followed his orders with chilling precision, avoiding all work, limiting contact with others, ceasing to write. And instead of finding peace, she began to feel herself unraveling. Her imagination, deprived of outlets, turned inward and dark. The result was her iconic short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. In that story, a woman, confined to a room for a so-called rest cure, becomes obsessed with the wallpaper's shifting patterns. As the days wear on, she believes there is a woman trapped inside it, and eventually she believes she herself must free the figure by tearing the wallpaper down. The narrative is a harrowing descent into madness, a fictional account born from Gilman's very real torment. Her story was a protest in prose. It forced the public and even Dr. Mitchell to confront the dangers of a treatment that silenced rather than healed. Gilman would later write that publishing the story helped bring change. But how many voices were never heard? How many women, less privileged than Gilman, were dismissed, confined, and forgotten under the weight of medical advice? The rest cure's popularity was not short-lived. It persisted for decades, bolstered by a patriarchal culture that valued obedience in women more than well-being. The treatment exposed a broader truth, that medicine, when guided by bias, becomes a tool of oppression. Male patients with similar symptoms were told to take vacations, seek adventure, or engage in hobbies. Women were told to lie down and shut their eyes to the world. Men were encouraged to externalize their stress, to reshape the world. Women were expected to internalize their distress and shrink within it. There was no room for dissent. If a woman resisted the cure, she was seen as unstable. If she cried out, she was called hysterical. If she complied and grew worse, her condition was blamed on her constitution. The logic was circular and cruel. If the treatment didn't work, the fault lay not in the method, but in the patient. And so the rest cure became a quiet epidemic, a medical silencing of women across generations. It hid beneath a veneer of compassion while enacting a kind of psychological violence. It taught women that to heal, they must first disappear, that their intellect, their creativity, their desire to speak and be heard were symptoms of disease rather than signs of life. This practice, though now seen as archaic, leaves a lingering legacy. Today, women are still more likely to be prescribed sedatives over therapy, more likely to have their physical symptoms dismissed as emotional, more likely to be told that they are overreacting, exaggerating, or imagining pain. The ghost of the rest cure still haunts modern medicine, not in its exact form, but in its ethos. The story of the rest cure is not just medical history. It is a warning, a reflection of how science can be used to reinforce prejudice, how care can be twisted into compliance, and how easily the voices of women can be buried beneath a diagnosis. The rest cure did not make women well. It made them quiet. And in that silence, the system believed it had succeeded. But beneath the stillness, countless women were breaking. And yet, from that suffering came resistance. Stories like Gilman's did more than expose injustice. They reclaimed the narrative. They transformed pain into protest, silence into speech. Today, remembering the rest cure is not about reliving its horror. It's about honoring those who survived it and ensuring that no treatment ever again disguises control as compassion. Oh, how Charlotte Perkins Gilman exposed the rest cure in The Yellow Wallpaper. Imagine being told that your thoughts, your fears, your creativity, everything that makes you who you are the cause of your suffering, that your only hope for recovery lies in total silence, isolation, and forced inactivity. This was the reality faced by countless women in the late 19th century. And one of them, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, transformed that torment into one of the most chilling psychological stories in American literature, The Yellow Wallpaper. Published in 1892, The Yellow Wallpaper is more than just a haunting tale of descent into madness. It is a razor-sharp critique of a medical practice known as the rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the same physician who treated Gilman herself. The rest cure involved total isolation, strict bed rest, and the prohibition of any intellectual or creative activity. Patients, mostly women, were not allowed to read, write, or even engage in conversation. They were told that their minds needed to stop working so they could heal. In reality, it often drove them to the edge of collapse. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a young mother when she began experiencing severe postpartum depression. Seeking help, she turned to Dr. Mitchell and underwent his rest cure. It nearly destroyed her. She later wrote, "I came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over." She knew then that something had to change, not just for her, but for other women like her, trapped in a system that equated their intelligence and ambition with illness. That's when she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper. The story follows an unnamed narrator who is confined to a room with sickly yellow wallpaper, forbidden to write or express herself. As the days stretch into weeks, she begins to see a woman trapped behind the wallpaper's patterns, an eerie, crawling figure that mirrors her own sense of imprisonment. As the narrator loses her grip on reality, she identifies more and more with the woman behind the wallpaper, until finally she tears it down in a frenzy, crawling over her fainted husband as she declares, "I've got out at last." Gilman's story was dismissed by many male critics of the time as hysterical fiction. But women readers saw the terrifying truth it contained. It was not just about madness. It was about the erasure of female autonomy, the consequences of silencing women's voices, and the violence of a medical system that ignored the realities of female experience. Gilman sent a copy of the story to Dr. Mitchell. She wanted him to see what his treatment had done. There is no record of his response. The power of the yellow wallpaper lies not just in its literary brilliance, but in its brutal honesty. Gilman wrote it with the express purpose of preventing other women from enduring what she had endured. She later said, "It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy." And in many ways, it did. The story became a cornerstone of feminist literature, studied and revered for its unflinching portrayal of mental health, gender roles, and societal control. The story also challenged the broader assumption that women's emotional pain was merely imaginary or hormonal, a relic of the ancient belief in hysteria, the idea that a woman's uterus could wander through her body, causing madness. Though the word hysteria was still in medical use during Gilman's time, she exposed how those in power used pseudoscience to dismiss the voices of women, especially when they cried out for independence, education, or creative freedom. What makes Gilman's work even more tragic is how close it came to being autobiographical. She wasn't simply inventing horror, she was recounting it. The rest cure, though intended to heal, became a psychological weapon. It turned intelligent, creative women into passive dependents. Gilman escaped that fate, but only barely. Through her writing, she fought back. In The Yellow Wallpaper, the protagonist's husband, John, is a physician who insists he knows what's best. He belittles her feelings, calling her silly and nervous, insisting she rest and stop thinking so much. His intentions might seem loving, but they are steeped in the same patriarchal assumptions that define the rest cure itself, that women are too fragile to handle their own lives, too emotional to understand their own needs. In the end, it is his control, not her illness, that truly breaks her. Gilman's life after the story proved her resilience. She went on to become a prominent feminist thinker, lecturer, and social reformer. Her work laid the groundwork for future conversations about women's mental health, gender inequality, and the dangers of medical authority unchecked by empathy or understanding. But it all began with a short story, written out of desperation and rage, a story that continues to resonate today. Even now, over a century later, The Yellow Wallpaper speaks with a voice that refuses to be silenced. It warns us of what happens when we treat women's pain as fiction and their creativity as pathology. And it reminds us that the most haunting prisons are not built of stone, but of beliefs that confine and diminish, that dress up cruelty as care and call it healing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman escaped the wallpaper, but only because she dared to write. The case of Elizabeth Packard, institutionalized for disagreeing with her husband's theology. What if speaking your mind could get you locked away for years? In 1860s America, a woman named Elizabeth Packard dared to disagree with her husband. Not with his politics, not with his behavior, but with his theology. And for that, she was declared insane and imprisoned in an asylum against her will. This isn't the plot of a Gothic novel, it's real history. A harrowing portrait of how the law, religion, and medicine once conspired to silence women, and how one woman fought back to change it. Elizabeth Packard was intelligent, educated, and outspoken. Born in Massachusetts in 1816, she married Theophilus Packard, a Calvinist minister, and for years played the part expected of her, a devoted wife, mother of 6, and supporter of her husband's religious mission. But over time, her beliefs began to evolve. She began questioning rigid doctrines. She spoke publicly about her views. She voiced doubts in church and at home, and in 19th this century America, that alone was enough to be branded unstable. At the time, Illinois law granted husbands absolute power to institutionalize their wives without a trial, without evidence, and without the woman's consent. All it took was a signature from a husband and a cooperative doctor. No one asked if she was dangerous. No one asked if she was ill. Only whether her words or behaviors defied the expectations of obedience and silence. So in 1860, when Theophilus Packard grew tired of his wife's questions, her public critiques of his sermons, he had her declared insane and committed to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane at Jacksonville. She was forcibly removed from her home and separated from her children. Her crime? Thinking differently. Inside the asylum, Elizabeth Packard encountered horror, not of madness but of injustice. She wasn't surrounded by wild-eyed lunatics. She found dozens of other women who, like her, had been locked away for reasons that had little to do with actual mental illness. Some had angered their husbands, others had inherited money. Still, others had dared to speak up. Packard spent 3 years confined in that institution, constantly battling not just the doctors and attendants, but the very assumptions that justified her captivity. She refused to fake submission. She wrote constantly, documenting everything she saw: abuse, neglect, corruption. She petitioned for her release. She demanded her day in court. Eventually, her persistence paid off. After 3 long years, she was granted a public trial, a rare opportunity for any committed woman. With the help of allies and sympathetic observers, Packard testified in her own defense, standing calmly before a jury of men and proving with eloquence and reason that she was not insane. She won. The jury took just minutes to declare her sane, but freedom didn't mean safety. Upon returning home, her husband tried to imprison her again, this time locking her in a bedroom. She escaped through a window. She took her story public. And that's when Elizabeth Packard transformed from survivor to reformer. She published books detailing her ordeal, raw, vivid accounts that shocked the public and stirred lawmakers. Her most famous work, The Prisoner's Hidden Life, exposed the conditions inside asylums and the ease with which women could be silenced. She didn't just seek sympathy. She demanded change. Elizabeth traveled the country campaigning for legal reform. Thanks to her efforts, multiple states rewrote their laws. In Illinois, women could no longer be committed without a public hearing. In other states, similar safeguards were put in place. Her advocacy helped birth the early patients' rights movement, laying groundwork for reforms in mental health care and civil liberties. But her legacy is deeper than legislation. Elizabeth Packard exposed a quiet horror hiding in plain sight: the use of psychiatry as a tool of control. Her story shows how easily a medical system can become weaponized, not against disease, but against dissent. How language like delusional, irrational, or hysterical can be used not to diagnose, but to dismiss. And how institutions meant to heal can become cages, locking away inconvenient truths and those who speak them. She fought not just for herself, but for the countless women who never made it out, who never got a trial, who were too poor, too isolated, too broken to resist. And she did it all while being called mad. Even today, her story echoes in hospital wards and courtrooms. Women are still more likely to have their pain dismissed, their opinions labeled emotional, their resistance interpreted as instability. The ghost of Elizabeth Packard walks beside every woman who dares to say, "I disagree." She was not a victim of insanity. She was a victim of obedience demanded and silence enforced. And she turned that silence into a rallying cry. Because in the end, Elizabeth Packard didn't just reclaim her freedom, she redefined what sanity truly meant: clarity, courage, and a refusal to bow to injustice. So the next time someone questions whether a woman's anger is justified or calls her voice too loud, too passionate, too much, remember Elizabeth. Remember that sanity isn't submission. It's the ability to see injustice and say, without apology, no more. Electric shock therapy used on emotional women. Imagine waking up strapped to a bed, the room sterile and echoing with the hum of an unseen generator. You're not a criminal, not violent. You're simply sad, anxious, grieving, or perhaps too outspoken for your time. And for that, you're about to have electricity pass through your brain. This isn't a scene from a dystopian novel. This was real. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, countless women were subjected to crude forms of electric shock therapy, often without consent, because they were labeled too emotional. At a time when psychiatry was in its infancy and women were often seen as emotionally fragile or mentally inferior, the definition of mental illness was dangerously vague. A woman suffering from postpartum depression, trauma, or even marital dissatisfaction could be committed to an asylum. Sometimes permanently. Her husband or father's signature was all it took. And once institutionalized, she became a subject, often forgotten, often abused, beneath the cold authority of science. These institutions were rarely places of healing. They were more often places of experimentation. The earliest forms of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, were not the refined procedures of modern medicine. They were brutal. Doctors placed electrodes on a woman's head and sent jolts of electricity through her skull. The goal was to induce a seizure based on the belief that seizures somehow rewired the brain. It was a theory born from desperation and poor understanding. The results were traumatic. Patients convulsed violently. Bones were sometimes broken during the induced seizures. Memory loss was common. Some women emerged from the treatment unable to recall their own names, their families, or even how to speak. But if they appeared docile afterward, quieter, slower, more compliant, this was seen as success. Silence, not recovery, was the goal. Worse still, these treatments were sometimes repeated endlessly. Daily sessions, weekly shocks. Restraints were used not just for safety, but for control. And in the most harrowing cases, doctors experimented with applying electric current to other parts of the body, hands, spine, genitals, believing that nerves needed to be reset like faulty wires. They didn't understand what they were doing, but they did it anyway. The rise of electricity in the 19th century fascinated the medical world. It was seen as mystical, powerful, and full of untapped potential. Devices like phoretic machines, galvanic belts, and electrostatic wands were marketed as miracle cures. Electrotherapy clinics began to spring up across Europe and America. But while men were often treated for muscle stiffness or circulation, women were targeted for emotional instability, labeled with vague terms like hysteria, melancholia, or moral insanity. One notorious example is the case of Elizabeth Packard, institutionalized by her husband in 1860 simply for disagreeing with his religious views. Though not subjected to electric treatment since it was not yet in use, her story became a symbol of how easily women could be silenced by the asylum system. Later, when electric therapy entered the medical mainstream, similar women would face not just confinement, but physical trauma under the guise of progress. Doctors justified these treatments by arguing that female brains were more prone to imbalance. Their emotions were unstable, their desires dangerous. An electric current, they believed, could calm the storm. But what it actually did was erase parts of these women, their memories, their independence, their voices, and yet these weren't fringe experiments. This was endorsed by mainstream medicine. Prestigious hospitals, academic journals, and leading psychiatrists supported it. It wasn't just a few misguided individuals. It was a system, a system that pathologized femininity and turned suffering into spectacle. Over time, public outcry and medical reform began to push back. The barbaric versions of ECT began to decline by the mid-20th century, replaced by more refined techniques. Consent became a legal requirement, guidelines were established, and today, while modern ECT still exists and can be beneficial under strict regulation, its dark origins cast a long shadow. This story is not about medicine alone. It is about power, how it's used, and who it's used against. It is about how science, when stripped of empathy, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. It's about how society used fear and ignorance to institutionalize the very emotions that make us human. We must remember these women, not as nameless patients in faded ledgers, but as people who were misunderstood, mistreated, and too often forgotten. Their suffering teaches us something vital, that true healing begins with listening, not silencing, and that compassion, not compliance, should be the measure of mental health care. What they needed was understanding. What they received was voltage. And in the cold silence after the shock, the world lost something irreplaceable, a voice that deserved to be heard. Doctors blamed the womb for mental illness. There was a time in history when the very core of a woman's body, her womb, was blamed for everything from sadness to madness. The uterus, a sacred vessel of life, was once considered a source of emotional instability, mental disorder, and even spiritual corruption. This belief was so deeply entrenched that it gave rise to one of the most enduring and damaging diagnoses in medical history: hysteria. The word itself betrays its roots. Hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. In ancient Greek medicine, it was thought that the womb could literally wander through the body, like an animal inside the woman's flesh, causing suffocation, seizures, and erratic emotions. This condition, dubbed the wandering womb, was a popular explanation for any behavior that strayed from patriarchal expectations. If a woman wept too much, laughed too loudly, refused sex, or simply appeared distraught, the womb was to blame. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, wrote extensively about this condition. His theories were picked up and expanded by later Roman physicians like Galen, who asserted that the womb was the source of all manner of female disease. According to them, the uterus, when not pregnant or sexually satisfied, would become restless and begin to migrate inside the body, pressing against other organs and causing chaos. The treatment, pregnancy, marriage, sexual intercourse, anything that would anchor the uterus and return the woman to normalcy. In the Middle Ages, this belief was further entangled with religious superstition. Women were considered morally and physically weak, their bodies corruptible, and their minds vulnerable. Hysteria became a catch-all term for sin, sexuality, and suffering. Women who experienced seizures, hallucinations, or emotional disturbances were said to be possessed. Some were burned as witches. Others were bled, purged, or subjected to exorcisms. The womb was no longer just a medical curiosity. It became a vessel of evil, blamed for spiritual failure and bodily corruption. As medicine moved into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, scientific language replaced superstition, but not the bias. Physicians began studying anatomy and neurology, yet the uterus remained the favored scapegoat. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hysteria became a formal medical diagnosis. It covered an astonishing range of symptoms: anxiety, insomnia, irritability, sexual desire, depression, fainting, and even ambition. The list was so expansive that nearly any woman could be labeled hysterical at any moment, especially if she stepped out of line. Treatments for hysteria were often invasive, degrading, and based on the idea that the female body was inherently pathological. One such treatment was the infamous pelvic massage, performed by male physicians to induce what was termed a hysterical paroxysm, a euphemism for orgasm. It was believed that this release would calm the woman's nervous system. The practice became so widespread and time-consuming that it led to the invention of the vibrator, not as a tool for pleasure, but as a labor-saving device for exhausted doctors. Other treatments were even more severe: ice baths, isolation, surgical removal of the ovaries or clitoris, and eventually electroshock therapy. In some cases, women were institutionalized for life, their condition never improving because it was never real to begin with. They were suffering not from madness but from grief, repression, abuse, or the unbearable weight of social expectation. The case of French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot in the late 19th century is particularly revealing. Charcot showcased women diagnosed with hysteria in public lectures, treating them as subjects of scientific spectacle. These women were hypnotized, prodded, and posed to demonstrate symptoms for male audiences, turning suffering into theater and mental illness into something performative. One of Charcot's most famous students, Sigmund Freud, would later reshape hysteria into psychoanalytic theory. Freud believed that repressed sexual trauma caused hysteria, and while his work did open doors to understanding the psychological roots of distress, it also continued the legacy of linking female emotion to dysfunction. His theories often emphasized sexual repression, reinforcing the idea that women's mental health was inextricably tied to their reproductive identity. By the early 20th century, hysteria began to lose its grip as a medical diagnosis, replaced by more specific psychiatric labels. But the damage had been done. Generations of women had been pathologized, mistreated, and silenced under the guise of medicine. Their pain was not heard, it was interpreted. Their resistance was not understood, it was subdued. Their identity was not respected, it was reduced to a single organ. Even today, the echoes of this history linger. Women are still more likely to be told their symptoms are psychosomatic. Female pain is underdiagnosed, undertreated, and too often dismissed. The stereotype of the hysterical woman persists in culture, media, and even in clinical settings. We may no longer speak of a wandering womb, but the legacy of hysteria continues to haunt modern medicine. Understanding this history is not just about medical progress. It is about confronting centuries of systemic bias. It is about seeing how science can be shaped by culture and how easily fear of the unknown can become institutional doctrine. It is about listening to those who were never meant to be heard. And most of all, it is about reclaiming the narrative. Because the womb was never the problem. The problem was the fear of what it represented: life, autonomy, complexity, power. To remember this is not merely to look back in horror, it is to demand that the mistakes of the past are never repeated, that no woman is ever again told she is crazy for feeling too much, that no one's truth is reduced to anatomy, that every voice, no matter how inconvenient, is finally allowed to speak. The rise of the moral treatment movement and its failure. In the early 19th century, something revolutionary stirred inside the cold stone corridors of asylums, places once reserved for society's discarded. For centuries, those suffering from mental illness were locked in chains, beaten, caged like animals, or abandoned entirely. But then a philosophy emerged that promised mercy, a reform, a new path forward. It was called moral treatment, and at first it seemed like salvation. But what began as a beacon of hope quickly revealed another haunting truth. The same walls that promised healing could still imprison. The origins of moral treatment can be traced to Enlightenment-era Europe, where thinkers began to challenge the cruelty of past practices. In France, physician Philippe Pinel became a legend for unchaining patients at Paris's Bicêtre Hospital in the 1790s, declaring that madness should be met with understanding, not violence. Across the English Channel, Quaker reformer William Tuke created the York Retreat, an asylum with no chains, no rods, no screams. There, patients engaged in gardening, calm reflection, and shared meals. It was radical, humane, and deeply spiritual. As the movement made its way to the United States, its torch was carried by reformers like Dorothea Dix, who personally visited over 300 jails, asylums, and poorhouses. What she found was horrifying. People with schizophrenia chained naked in basements, women with depression whipped for laziness when and children with epilepsy treated as criminals. Her tireless advocacy led to the construction of over 30 state-funded psychiatric hospitals. Meanwhile, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, a leading American psychiatrist, designed hospitals with wide, airy halls, gardens, and natural light. He believed the very structure of a building could soothe the mind. These new hospitals were built on a dream. Sunlight filtered through massive windows. Gardens lined the courtyards. Libraries, chapels, and dining halls filled the grounds. Patients were given clean clothes, warm meals, and a structured schedule meant to soothe their souls. The madness, it was believed, could be calmed through peace, order, and moral example. For a moment in time, this was the gold standard of psychiatric care. But inside the gilded halls of these institutions, a subtler, more insidious control took root. Patients were expected to conform to rigid behavioral norms. They were forbidden from expressing anger, despair, or eccentricity, emotions and behaviors still considered part of their illness. Religion and moral obedience were emphasized. Prayer was encouraged. Quiet submission was rewarded. Even the simple act of speaking too much or questioning authority could be deemed a setback, a sign of regression. Especially for women, the rules became a vice grip. A woman who read novels instead of sewing, who questioned her husband's decisions, or who mourned too long after childbirth could be deemed morally unfit. Diagnoses like moral insanity or hysteria became catch-alls for female disobedience. Many women, once admitted, never saw freedom again, not because of violence or criminal behavior, but because they failed to conform to the roles prescribed to them. By the late 19th century, the cracks were widening. These once hopeful institutions grew overcrowded. The ideal of individualized care gave way to bureaucracy. Doctors, overwhelmed and under-resourced, relied more on restraint, sedation, and routine. Solitary confinement was reintroduced, now labeled as therapeutic isolation. Electrotherapy and cold baths became common, and the warm image of moral treatment began to fracture under the weight of its own failure. In truth, moral treatment had always harbored a contradiction. It promised to cure by controlling, to heal by silencing. While it removed the whips and chains, it replaced them with another kind of force, a moral one. Patients were not given voices, they were given scripts. They were not seen as individuals with insight. They were seen as broken things in need of fixing, or worse, obedience. And when they didn't improve, when the conditions of their minds did not respond to order and calm, they were left to decay within institutions that no longer knew what to do with them. Some stayed institutionalized for decades. Others died there. Their letters went unread. Their stories were forgotten. And the world, comforted by the appearance of compassion, moved on. Yet even in failure, the moral treatment movement leaves behind a legacy we must confront. It teaches that the face of cruelty can change, put on a smile, soften its tone, and still remain intact. It warns that reform without reflection is just repackaged repression. And it reminds us that systems designed for care can slip slowly and silently into systems of control, especially when one voice dominates and others are silenced. In modern hindsight, it's easy to romanticize the moral treatment movement as a noble, if imperfect, step forward. But for those who lived it, the patients forced into daily silence, the women punished for their intellect, the men made to confess sins they never believed were sins, it was another form of erasure. Their madness was not always illness. Sometimes it was resistance. Sometimes it was grief. Sometimes it was simply being different in a world that demanded sameness. One of the most unsettling truths is how these institutions, while dressed in the language of compassion, functioned as mirrors of society's deeper prejudices. People of color, immigrants, and the poor were disproportionately labeled as morally defective. What passed for care often became moral policing. The asylum, once meant to shelter, became a fortress of conformity, defending the norms of a society afraid of disorder and difference. So when we speak of moral treatment, we must be honest. Yes, it ended the era of overt torture in psychiatric care. Yes, it opened the door to more humane architectural designs and the idea that environment influences mind. But it also failed to grasp the complexity of mental illness, failed to include patients in their own healing, and failed to dismantle the power structures that caused so much suffering in the first place. And so, the legacy of moral treatment is not a clean victory or a clear failure. It is a cautionary tale, one that whispers through the corridors of today's hospitals and clinics, one that asks us again and again, are we truly helping those in pain, or are we simply reshaping the walls around them? Menstrual madness when periods were a medical emergency. Imagine being told your body's natural cycle renders you unfit for thought, for learning, for ambition. That once a month your mind becomes unstable, dangerously so, and for that you must lie in bed in silence until the storm of your biology passes. This was not mythology, this was medicine. In the Victorian era, menstruation wasn't just misunderstood, it was pathologized. And girls entering puberty were often treated as though they were succumbing to an illness, a medical emergency, a threat to their minds, their futures, and their womanhood. In the 19th century, medicine was dominated by male physicians who had little understanding of female biology beyond what they imagined. The female body was seen as inherently delicate, volatile, and ruled by reproduction. Menstruation, in their view, was not a biological process, it was a weakness. It was believed to drain vital energy, weaken the mind, and destabilize the emotions. The term menstrual madness was coined to describe a range of behaviors that today would be considered normal emotional responses or mood shifts. One of the most chilling practices came in the form of prescribed rest. When a girl began menstruating, she was often withdrawn from school. Her books were taken away. Any intellectual activity was forbidden. The belief was that thinking too hard while bleeding would overstrain the brain, causing hysteria, mental collapse, or infertility. Some doctors even suggested that menstruation and education were incompatible. A menstruating girl reading a novel could be risking her future ability to bear children. The prescription wasn't merely metaphorical. Young women were placed on what was called the rest cure. Developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the rest cure involved confinement to a bed for weeks or months, complete isolation, no physical or intellectual stimulation, and often forced feeding with milk-based diets. This method was most famously endured and later condemned by writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman in her story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Though not all cases were that extreme, many girls experienced variations of this treatment, imposed for nothing more than the timing of their biology. Beyond rest, menstrual control became a target of experimental treatments. Some doctors recommended cold baths, sedatives, or even mild electric therapy to balance the nerves. Others turned to uterine surgery, removing ovaries, or applying leeches to the abdomen in extreme cases where menstruation was deemed disruptive or disordered. These invasive procedures were rarely necessary, often traumatic, and rooted more in fear than science. What drove this hysteria over menstruation was not just ignorance, it was ideology. Victorian society depended on rigid gender roles. A woman's destiny was motherhood and submission. Anything that threatened this, education, autonomy, ambition, had to be pathologized. And so menstruation became a convenient anchor, a reason to keep women home, a justification to deny them schooling, a way to assert that their very biology disqualified them from full participation in society. Scientific journals of the time were littered with so-called studies proving that menstruation caused cognitive impairment. One physician warned that menstruating women should not read poetry, as the stimulation could lead to uterine inflammation. Others warned against piano practice, citing the vibrations as potentially harmful to the reproductive organs. And these ideas weren't fringe, they were mainstream. Girls from elite families were most affected by this medical dogma. Educators and physicians worked together to create school schedules around menstrual cycles, even limiting how far a girl could walk or what classes she could attend. Physical education was almost always banned, and those who resisted, girls who dared to keep studying, reading, writing, were often labeled deviant or emotionally unstable. But resistance did begin to grow. In the late 19th century, women physicians began to challenge these narratives. Pioneers like Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi fought back with evidence. She conducted rigorous studies proving that menstruation had no adverse effects on cognition or physical strength. Her work earned awards and recognition, yet the culture was slow to change. Myths have deep roots, especially when they serve those in power. By the early 20th century, the grip of menstrual madness as a diagnosis began to weaken. More women entered medicine, psychology, and education. Science began to recognize that the female body was not a ticking time bomb of emotions, but a complex, capable organism. Yet echoes of this era remain. Even today, women are sometimes dismissed as hormonal or irrational when expressing anger, frustration, or grief. The legacy lingers in the language, in the biases, in the systems. We look back now and wonder, how could something so natural have been so feared? How could an entire gender's intelligence and autonomy be questioned on the basis of a cycle as old as humanity itself? The answer lies not in medicine, but in power, in a system that needed women to be small, quiet, and confined. Menstruation was never the real issue. Control was. And so we remember this not just as a bizarre historical misstep, but as a mirror. A reminder that the medical establishment is not immune to prejudice, that science must be questioned, and that every girl deserves not silence, not bed rest, but truth, respect, and the freedom to grow beyond the boundaries once drawn in the name of biology. Dr. Isaac Ray's theory that too much learning could drive women mad. In the 19th century, a quiet war was being waged, not on battlefields, but in classrooms and libraries. It was a war against women's minds. The weapons were not swords or guns, but medical journals, lectures, and social fears, disguised as scientific facts. At the center of this intellectual siege stood men like Dr. Isaac Ray, one of the founding figures of American psychiatry, who warned the world of a growing danger: the educated woman. Dr. Ray, a respected physician and one of the original founders of the American Psychiatric Association, argued that too much learning could be fatal to a woman's mind. In his view, education was not just inappropriate for women, it was actively dangerous. He claimed that exposing women to intense intellectual activity would overstimulate their delicate nervous systems, leading to emotional collapse, hysteria, or even infertility. To Ray and his contemporaries, the female brain was a fragile organ, easily unbalanced by too much thought. The logic was both pseudoscientific and deeply patriarchal. Ray and others believed that because women were biologically destined for motherhood, all of their bodily and mental energy should be preserved for reproduction. If too much of that energy was redirected to thought, to reason, to study, to ambition, it would disrupt the natural balance of the female body. The uterus would suffer, the mind would fray, the woman would unravel. This theory wasn't fringe. It was widely accepted and reinforced by leading physicians, educators, and even some clergy. They warned that educated women were more prone to nervous disorders, depression, and infertility. College, they claimed, could damage a woman's health permanently. Some institutions even limited the curriculum for female students, fearing that subjects like mathematics or philosophy would tip the scales of sanity. Others barred women entirely. Dr. Edward Clark, a Harvard professor and contemporary of Ray, famously echoed these sentiments in his book Sex in Education in 1873. He argued that young women who pursued higher education risked damaging their reproductive organs. According to Clark, the energy used by the brain would starve the uterus. The result? Sickly women, sterile wives, childless homes. In his words, a woman's body cannot carry the double burden of brain work and reproduction. These warnings weren't just academic musings, they had real consequences. Ambitious young women were discouraged, shamed, or forcibly removed from school. Parents were told their daughters would go mad or become barren if they studied too hard. Society enforced a choice. You could be intelligent or you could be feminine, but not both. The cruelty of this doctrine was not just in its restriction, but in its circular logic. If a woman did experience emotional distress, grief, stress, or mental illness, it was blamed on her attempts to think too much. Her suffering became proof of the theory. If she succeeded, it was an anomaly. If she failed, it was her fault for reaching beyond her station. And so generations of brilliant women were silenced before they could speak. not with chains or threats, but with warnings. Warnings that their thoughts would cost them their sanity, their fertility, their future. Yet some refused to be caged by fear. Women like Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female physician in the United States, who shattered those theories with every patient she healed. Or Mary Wollstonecraft, who demanded intellectual equality a century earlier, challenging the very roots of such medical misogyny. And later, women like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who exposed the psychological toll of domestic confinement in her haunting story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a thinly veiled critique of the so-called rest cure prescribed for intelligent women. Still, the legacy of Dr. Ray's theory cast a long shadow. Well into the 20th century, women's mental health was pathologized through the lens of education and ambition. Female students who displayed anxiety or depression were told to withdraw, rest, or return to domestic duties. Ambition itself was suspect. The desire to achieve outside the home was framed as a symptom, not a strength. Even today, echoes of that thinking linger. Women in academic or leadership positions still face questions about their emotional fitness. Women who express strong opinions are called unstable. Women who pursue both career and family are warned about balance, as if they're destined to break. The ghost of Ray's warning whispers still that a woman who thinks too deeply or dreams too broadly is bound to pay a price. But history has proven otherwise. The very act of education has empowered generations of women to change the world, to heal, to invent, to lead. Their minds did not collapse, they expanded. Their emotions did not betray them, they fueled revolutions. The world did not crumble because women entered the classroom. It grew stronger, richer, more just. To remember Dr. Isaac Ray's theory is not to grant it power, but to name the forces that once tried to keep women small. To see how fear, dressed as science, can shape the fate of millions. And to understand that the war against women's minds was never about biology. It was about control. And now, as more voices rise in every field, science, art, politics, medicine, we must say what should have been said long ago. A woman's intellect is not a threat to her body. Her ambition is not an illness. Her learning is not a liability. It is her birthright. Hydrotherapy, a cold shower for out-of-control women. In the dim, echoing halls of 19th century asylums, where reason and cruelty often walked hand in hand, water was not a source of cleansing. It was a weapon. Hydrotherapy, a treatment hailed by physicians of the time as progressive and humane, became one of the most chilling tools used to subdue women deemed too emotional, too outspoken, or simply inconvenient. It was, in theory, a form of therapy. In practice, it was punishment in the guise of medicine. Women admitted to asylums were often not mad by any modern definition of the word. They might have suffered postpartum depression, grief, anxiety, or they might have merely defied their husbands, read too much, or spoken their minds too loudly. Once labeled unstable, they were subjected to a battery of treatments, none more widely adopted or more quietly brutal than hydrotherapy. At first glance, the methods seemed benign: water jets, baths, and wraps. But the reality was far colder, literally. Women were plunged into freezing baths for hours, their bodies restrained beneath heavy canvas sheets to prevent movement. Pressure hoses, more commonly used to wash down stables, were turned on screaming patients, the full force of icy water battering their skin until they were too shocked or too weak to fight back. The idea was that water could cool the nerves, but what it really did was inflict enough suffering to force obedience. This was not isolated. Across Europe and North America, hydrotherapy rooms became standard in mental institutions. Often tiled, damp, and windowless, these chambers echoed with cries that were dismissed as symptoms rather than warnings. Nurses were instructed to maintain a clinical detachment. Patients were numbers, their agony, data. Physicians recorded changes in behavior not as signs of trauma, but as evidence the treatment was working. One particularly horrifying practice was the continuous bath. A woman could be immersed in a lukewarm or cold tub for hours or even days, her body monitored like a specimen while she slowly succumbed to sensory deprivation. Talking was forbidden, movement discouraged. The water never warm enough for comfort, never cold enough to kill, just numbing, disorienting, silencing. In some asylums, women were also subjected to the wet sheet pack. They were wrapped tightly in cold, damp linens and left immobile for hours, unable to scratch an itch or shift their position. The stated purpose was to calm agitation, but the psychological effect was one of entrapment and paralysis. Survivors described the sensation not as therapy, but as burial. Hydrotherapy was especially common for women because female emotional expression was pathologized. Tears were signs of instability. Anger was hysteria. Resistance was madness. The asylum system was built on the assumption that a calm woman was a healthy woman, and if she wasn't calm, she could be made to be. With water, with force. Some physicians sincerely believed in its efficacy. They wrote papers claiming hydrotherapy reduced violence, pacified mania, and eliminated sexual urges. But they failed or refused to see the obvious. Women emerged from these treatments subdued not because they were healed, but because they were terrified. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who had first-hand experience with institutional control, wrote of the dangers of forced compliance. Though she escaped hydrotherapy herself, she observed others who didn't. Their personalities dulled, their spirits crushed, their identities washed away, one bath at a time. In one documented case from a New Jersey asylum in 1905, a young woman named Sarah was repeatedly hosed with cold water until she collapsed from exhaustion. Her only offense? She refused to stop crying after her child was taken from her. The doctors wrote she showed marked improvement after treatment. What they didn't record was the vacant stare she carried for weeks afterward. The injustice was compounded by how easy it was to get a woman committed. A signature from a husband, brother, or father was often enough. No trial, no appeal. Once inside, the institution wielded absolute power. Complaints of abuse were chalked up to delusion. Pain was interpreted as proof of illness. Survival depended on silence. And what did the records say? That these women were improving, that hydrotherapy was effective, that the institution was doing its job, never mind the long-term trauma, the hypothermia, the broken minds that came not from disease, but from treatment. Never mind the voices that never recovered, the memories lost in the cold. Hydrotherapy began to fall out of favor in the mid-20th century, replaced by medications and more refined forms of psychiatric care. But its legacy lingers, a testament to how easily medicine can be weaponized when built on flawed premises. The treatment was never about curing. It was about controlling. And the cold water became a mirror, reflecting the fear society had of women who refused to be small. This history is not just a relic, it's a reminder that systems of care must be grounded in empathy, not obedience, that suffering cannot be sanitized with clinical language, and that the line between treatment and torture is thinner than we want to believe. To remember hydrotherapy is to remember those women who were drowned not in water, but in silence. Their stories matter. Their pain mattered, and no amount of ice can wash away the truth of what was done to them. The case of Louisa Lowe, gassed and drugged into silence. In the mid-19th century, when silence was mistaken for sanity and obedience for health, one woman refused to vanish quietly. Her name was Louisa Lowe, a mother, a widow, a writer. And her story is among the most chilling reminders of how mental institutions were once used not to protect the vulnerable, but to silence them. Louisa Lowe's only real crime was her refusal to stop speaking, and for that she was gassed, drugged, and locked away. But her words survived, and they exposed a system far more terrifying than anyone wanted to believe. Louisa was born into a respectable British family and married a clergyman. After he died, she began writing long, emotional letters to newspapers, religious leaders, and public figures. Her writing was impassioned, sometimes frantic, full of grief and desperation. But they were not irrational. She was calling out injustice, pleading for reform, demanding that society do better for the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. To those who read them, especially men in power, she was becoming inconvenient. In 1870, her family, disturbed by her intensity and embarrassed by her outspokenness, had her declared insane and forcibly committed to the Hereford Asylum. There, she was subjected to a brutal regimen of what was then considered treatment. She was gassed with chloroform, drugged into sedation, and kept in isolation. Her cries were dismissed. Her clarity was ignored. Her letters were confiscated. Her identity was erased. But Louisa Lowe did not vanish. She survived, and when she was released, she became a force of reckoning. She took her case to court. She spoke publicly. She described the things no one wanted to hear: the forced sedation, the humiliations, the way women were treated like property under Britain's lunacy laws. She wasn't the only one, but she was one of the first to be heard. Her legal fight exposed a harrowing truth that asylums were often filled with women who were simply inconvenient, too loud, too mournful, too unyielding. Wives who disobeyed husbands, daughters who challenged fathers, women whose voices could not be controlled. The asylums became the final silencing tool in a patriarchal arsenal. Lowe's courtroom testimony was electric. She detailed how women were medicated not for madness but for disobedience, how letters were used as evidence of insanity, especially when they expressed anger or grief, how the system rewarded the quiet and punished the bold. Her case ignited public debate and contributed to the eventual reform of mental health law in England. But despite the exposure, true justice never came. Her family never apologized. The doctors never faced consequences. The system, though pressured to change, remained intact for decades more. Louisa's voice rang out, but the walls of silence were thick. Her legacy, though, endures. In her own words, she once wrote, "The crime of the lunatic is that he speaks the truth too plainly." That sentence alone shatters illusions. She wasn't mad. She was prophetic. Her suffering wasn't healing. It was punishment for being visible, for refusing to fold. What makes Louisa's story even more disturbing is how easily it could happen, and how frequently it did. Victorian Britain's lunacy laws allowed family members, particularly male relatives, to institutionalize women with little legal oversight. A single doctor's signature could condemn a woman indefinitely. There was no trial, no defense, no appeal. And once inside, the more a woman protested her innocence, the more those protests were taken as proof of her madness. Chloroform, the gas used on Louisa, was a relatively new anesthetic at the time. It was hailed as a medical miracle. But in the hands of asylum staff, it became a tool for control. Louisa described how it was forced upon her when she resisted orders, her consciousness ripped away while her body was manipulated like an object. It wasn't used to heal, it was used to suppress. And when she finally awoke, there was no comfort, only more silence. Despite the trauma she endured, Louisa's writing sharpened. She published detailed accounts of her incarceration, including names, dates, and descriptions of her captors. In doing so, she risked everything: her reputation, her safety, even her freedom once more. But she believed fiercely that the truth could set others free. Her published work, The Bastilles of England, became a rallying cry for reformers and a thorn in the side of those in power. Through this book and her speeches, she exposed not only her personal ordeal, but a nationwide epidemic. Countless women, many sane, locked away for speaking, grieving, or challenging authority. Her work helped lay the foundation for growing public outrage and eventually the lunacy law reform movement. Louisa's bravery came at a price. Though she lived to see some changes in mental health law, she never fully regained the life she had before her institutionalization. She was treated as unstable even after her release. The stigma never left her. But she refused to be erased again. She often wrote that the truth was too dangerous to be heard in her time, and for many it was. Her insistence on truth-telling in a system built on silencing became both her weapon and her wound. She died without wealth or fame, but her legacy endured in the voices of the women who came after her: the suffragettes, the reformers, the survivors. Even today, Louisa Lowe's story forces us to ask hard questions. How many voices are still dismissed as hysteria? How many truths are still buried under diagnosis and sedation? And how often do we still confuse conformity with wellness? To remember Louisa is to remember every woman who dared to speak and was punished for it. She showed us that madness is not always a matter of mind, it is sometimes a reflection of what society refuses to face. Her words are still here, and they are still loud. Uterine irritation as a catch-all diagnosis for female disobedience. What if every time a woman disagreed, cried, or dared to act out of turn, her uterus was blamed? In the 19th century, doctors had a term, uterine irritation. It sounded medical, scientific. But in reality, it was a catch-all diagnosis for female behavior that defied male expectations. A woman's anger, her exhaustion, her ambition, even her grief could be attributed to one thing, a malfunctioning womb. This wasn't medicine. It was control. The idea began in the early 1800s, when the field of gynecology was still in its brutal infancy. Physicians like J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology, conducted surgical experiments on enslaved black women without anesthesia. Out of this legacy of violence came a medical model that viewed the uterus not just as an organ, but as a source of moral and mental instability. Doctors claimed that the uterus could become irritated, congested, or displaced, often with no physical proof. Symptoms were vague and conveniently broad: headaches, fatigue, insomnia, emotional outbursts, or simply a refusal to obey. Women who resisted marriage, complained about abuse, or demanded education were often labeled as suffering from uterine dysfunction. It was a diagnosis rooted in bias, not biology. Once labeled with uterine irritation, women were prescribed treatments that ranged from absurd to horrifying. Pelvic massages, ice-cold douches, internal cauterization, uterine repositioning with metal rods, and when all else failed, surgery. Some doctors recommended hysterectomy, the removal of the uterus, as a last resort to calm a woman's mind. The rationale? If the uterus was the source of unrest, its removal would restore peace. The logic was cruel and circular. Women were told they were unwell because they disobeyed and then punished medically for being unwell. They weren't asked what they felt. They were told. Their experiences, their voices, were rewritten into symptoms. Their pain was pathologized. Their resistance medicalized. The rest cure became another favored method. Popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, this involved isolating a woman in bed for weeks or months. No reading, no writing, no movement, no visitors, just enforced silence and submission, all in the name of healing her nerves. Many women emerged from the rest cure more broken than when they entered. Some never recovered. One of them was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. A brilliant writer and thinker, Gilman was prescribed the rest cure after suffering postpartum depression. She followed it to the letter until she nearly lost her mind. Her response was The Yellow Wallpaper, a searing short story about a woman driven mad by medical control. It became a foundational feminist text, exposing the deep trauma caused by doctors who refused to listen. But Gilman's story wasn't unique. Across Europe and America, women of every class were subjected to these treatments. Wealthy women were confined in private sanitariums. Working-class women were institutionalized or operated on without consent. And always, the uterus was the excuse. By the late 19th century, some physicians began to question the diagnosis. But even as uterine irritation fell out of formal use, its logic endured. Women's emotions continued to be viewed as suspect, their complaints dismissed as exaggeration or weakness. The body became a battlefield for authority. Who had the right to define what was real? Medical literature from the 19th century is riddled with euphemisms and contradictions. Women were said to suffer from neuralgia of the womb, congestive dysmenorrhea, or simply female disorder. These terms were vague by design, broad enough to apply to nearly any symptom, but always tracing back to the uterus. It allowed physicians to ignore mental health, trauma, and social context, replacing empathy with anatomical blame. Even menstruation itself was pathologized. A normal cycle was described as a monthly illness, and women who expressed discomfort were seen as weak or overly sensitive. If she was too emotional, uterine irritation. If she was too quiet, uterine irritation. If she was angry or independent or grieving or ambitious, uterine irritation. In a society that feared outspoken women, it was the perfect tool to label defiance as disease. Hospitals and private clinics marketed treatments to families as ways to restore obedience and femininity. Fathers and husbands became gatekeepers of medical care, deciding when and how a woman's body needed intervention. The line between medicine and punishment blurred, and women lost the right to narrate their own experiences. And behind the scenes, experimental surgeries grew more extreme. Some women underwent ovariotomies, the removal of healthy ovaries, as a way to treat hysteria or nervous disorders. One prominent physician claimed that ovaries were the seat of feminine emotion, and by removing them you could quiet a woman's spirit. It was nothing short of psychological lobotomy by way of the reproductive system. The most tragic aspect? Many women believed the diagnosis. Conditioned to see themselves through the eyes of men, they internalized the idea that their pain, confusion, or ambition meant something was wrong. Instead of fighting the diagnosis, they sought to be cured, submitting to treatments that stole their agency and often their health. By the early 20th century, brave voices began to resist. Women, writers, reformers, and early psychologists started to challenge the narrative. They demanded recognition of emotional labor, reproductive rights, and bodily autonomy. But the legacy of uterine irritation didn't vanish. It mutated. Modern terms like psychosomatic, anxious, or PMSing are often still used to minimize or dismiss women's concerns. Research shows that female patients wait longer for pain medication in emergency rooms. Their reports of symptoms are more likely to be questioned, second-guessed, or attributed to mood rather than cause. The ghost of uterine irritation still haunts modern medicine, so when we revisit this history, it's not to shame the past, it's to unlearn its distortions, to understand how institutions can pathologize identity, how power can masquerade as care, and how language, when misused, becomes a scalpel that cuts not the body, but the self. Because healing begins not with compliance, but with being heard. And every time a woman is believed, respected, and treated as whole, a piece of that old myth finally dies. The rise of opium and laudanum. Prescriptions to quiet women. Imagine being handed a bottle of syrup to soothe your nerves. It promises calm, quiet, and peace of mind. You're a woman in the 19th century, overwhelmed, isolated, perhaps grieving or simply exhausted from your duties. You take the medicine because the doctor says it will help. It does at first. The edge dulls, the world slows. But what you weren't told is that inside this little bottle is opium, and by the time you realize it, your body is already dependent on it. This isn't a rare story. It was a way of life, prescribed, promoted, and protected by the very institutions women were supposed to trust. In Victorian and Edwardian society, the image of the ideal woman was gentle, composed, nurturing, and above all, quiet. Women were expected to endure silently, to hold in their frustration, pain, trauma, and desire. When they didn't, when their emotions spilled into sadness, anger, or restlessness, they were diagnosed with female nervousness, neurasthenia, or hysteria. But rather than explore the cause of these symptoms, physicians reached for an easy solution: laudanum. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, was one of the most widely used medicines of the 18th and 19th centuries. It was given for everything from headaches and menstrual cramps to anxiety and insomnia. Often sweetened and flavored, it was even prescribed to children. But it was particularly common for women, who were viewed as physically weaker and more emotionally volatile. What doctors called nervous instability was often just the strain of living in a world that gave them no voice. These women were not addicts in the way society later imagined. They were mothers, wives, caretakers, many of them pillars of their communities, who had trusted in medicine. They were given opiates for grief, for anxiety, for the physical toll of repeated pregnancies. They were told that their suffering was unnatural and that silence was a virtue. Laudanum provided that silence. It dulled pain, yes, but it also dulled thought, memory, ambition. And that made it a perfect drug for a society that feared what women might say if they stayed awake. The irony is brutal. As women gained access to more medical care, that care was weaponized against them. Instead of being asked what they felt, they were given substances to make them feel less. Instead of treating trauma, doctors medicated symptoms. Instead of empowering, medicine was used to suppress. Laudanum use rose dramatically in the 1800s. It was affordable, easy to obtain, and legal. Sold in apothecaries, through mail-order catalogs, and even in popular patent medicines, it required no prescription. Brands with names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup or Godfrey's Cordial masked the true nature of their contents. Some women didn't even know they were taking opiates. Others knew but didn't feel they had a choice. It helped them sleep. It made them manageable. And as dependence grew, so did the silence. Women became increasingly isolated. Their emotions numbed, their energies drained, their identities blurred. They began to suffer not just from the problems they were medicating, but from the medication itself. Withdrawal symptoms, insomnia, confusion, stomach issues, even hallucinations. But most of all, shame. Because society saw these women not as victims of medical malpractice, but as failures of character, addicts, liabilities, weak. Even as the dangers of opium became known, laws were slow to change. The medical establishment was resistant to admitting its role. Doctors continued to prescribe morphine, heroin, and other opiates into the early 20th century, still cloaked in the language of treatment. It wasn't until the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 that the U.S. began seriously regulating these substances. But for many women, the damage was already done. Writers like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Mary Todd Lincoln battled laudanum addiction. So did countless women whose names never made it into history books. They suffered quietly, often invisibly, behind lace curtains and locked bedroom doors. And their stories reveal something essential, not about weakness, but about the cost of being unheard. This was more than a public health crisis. It was a cultural one, a society that dismissed women's pain as imaginary and medicated their emotions instead of validating them, created a cycle of dependence. Women weren't allowed to be angry or depressed or lost. They were allowed only one thing: to be calm, no matter the cost. And so opium became the perfect medicine for a world that demanded women disappear inside themselves. It was not prescribed to heal, but to silence. Today we live in a different time, but the echoes remain. Women are still more likely to be prescribed sedatives for emotional distress, still more likely to be told it's just stress or just hormones, still more likely to be treated for symptoms rather than understood for their stories. The history of opium and laudanum isn't just a tale of addiction. It's a mirror, a warning. It reminds us that medicine is never neutral, and that who it listens to and who it silences reveals far more about society than about science. Behind every bottle of laudanum was a woman trying to hold her world together. And behind every quiet room was a story that should have been heard but wasn't. Fainting rooms in Victorian homes were designed for emotional women. In the elegant homes of the Victorian era, nestled between drawing rooms and parlors, was a peculiar feature: the fainting room. It sounds romantic, almost theatrical, a place where delicate women could retreat to recover their composure. But behind its velvet curtains and chaise lounges was a chilling truth. These rooms were not designed for comfort. They were designed for control. Fainting rooms were a direct reflection of how society viewed women: fragile, emotional, unstable. They were expected to swoon, to collapse, to be overwhelmed by the sheer force of their femininity. And so homes were built with entire spaces dedicated to this presumed inevitability. These weren't optional luxuries. They were part of the architecture of gender itself, a quiet reinforcement of the idea that women could not and should not handle the full intensity of life. To understand fainting rooms, we have to understand the culture that birthed them. In Victorian society, women were cast as the moral and emotional heart of the household, but they were also seen as dangerously volatile. A woman who showed too much emotion risked being labeled hysterical. A woman who spoke too forcefully was deemed unwell. So the answer, according to the standards of the time, was to give her a place to collapse, a place to disappear, a place to faint. Part of the explanation lay in the fashion of the time. Corsets were tightly laced to achieve the hourglass figure demanded by beauty standards. These garments compressed the ribs, restricted breathing, and could cause lightheadedness or even unconsciousness. Fainting became so common that it was medicalized, treated not as a result of physical distress, but as further proof of female emotional instability. The solution was not to loosen the corset, but to institutionalize the collapse, and thus the fainting room. But this was more than just architecture. It was ideology built in plaster and silk. The fainting room functioned as a symbolic space where femininity was rehearsed and enforced. Girls were taught from a young age that to be overwhelmed was womanly, that to be physically or emotionally overtaken was natural, that expressing strength, stamina, or confrontation was unladylike. And so, when the world grew too loud, they retreated. Not because they wanted to, but because they were told they must. These rooms often contained a fainting couch, distinct from other furniture by its sloped back, designed to cradle the body in a gentle recline. Doctors, many of whom held shockingly primitive views about female biology, recommended frequent rest for women who were overwrought. Reading too much, writing too long, even feeling too strongly were seen as causes of nervous strain. The fainting room became the prescribed cure, not for illness but for emotion. And when a woman collapsed in public or at home, she wasn't rushed to a hospital. She was led quietly to the fainting room, where she could be hidden, where her response to a stifling world could be softened, disguised, and interpreted as just another symptom of her delicate nature. It was a space that both acknowledged suffering and erased its cause. The architecture made her pain invisible, even while accommodating it. The very idea of the fainting room was rooted in contradiction. It assumed that women were too fragile for the world, while designing that world to break them. It treated the symptoms while ignoring the systems. It gave women a couch when what they needed was agency. And yet, for some women, the fainting room may have offered a brief moment of solitude in a life of constant expectation, a place to breathe, even if the need for it was misunderstood, a quiet corner where they were allowed to rest, though not to rise in defiance. As the 20th century arrived, fainting rooms faded from architectural fashion. Women demanded and won more autonomy. Corsets loosened, votes were cast, voices rose, but the shadows of the fainting room lingered. The stereotype of the over-emotional woman persisted, shifting from velvet couch to clinical diagnosis. Today, women are still told they're too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. They may no longer be led to a fainting room, but they're still expected to shrink. Understanding the history of fainting rooms isn't about mocking the past. It's about seeing how deeply architecture can embody ideology, how walls and furniture can be used to shape behavior, how even spaces of rest can become prisons of expectation. These rooms remind us that the home, often romanticized as a sanctuary, can also be a site of quiet repression. That control does not always come with violence. It can arrive in the form of comfort, and that sometimes the softest spaces conceal the harshest truths. So, the next time you see a fainting couch in a museum or a vintage home, remember what it meant. It was not just a place to sit. It was a stage for a performance demanded by society. A place where women were expected to fold under the weight of their emotions, not because they were weak, but because the world refused to let them be strong. The case of Nellie Bly, a journalist who faked insanity to expose asylum horrors. In 1887, a young woman named Nellie Bly walked through the iron gates of New York's notorious Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum. But she didn't go there as a patient. Not really. She went undercover, faking insanity to infiltrate one of the most feared institutions in America. What she witnessed inside would become one of the most explosive pieces of investigative journalism in history. Her expose, 10 Days in a Madhouse, did more than make headlines. It forced the world to look at the monstrous way society treated its most vulnerable women. Nellie Bly was just 23 years old when she took on this dangerous assignment. Working for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, she was asked to report on a growing scandal, the treatment of women in mental asylums. Rather than interview doctors or cite anonymous sources, she chose something radical. She would become the story. To get committed, she checked into a boarding house and began acting erratically, speaking in disjointed sentences, refusing to sleep, accusing others of madness. It took less than 2 days for a doctor to label her insane. Once inside, Bly dropped the act. She behaved normally, asked questions, showed clarity of mind, but it didn't matter. The staff ignored her pleas. The more she insisted she was sane, the more convinced they became that she was truly insane. This was her first great discovery. Sanity, once questioned, becomes its own prison. The horrors she encountered inside the asylum were relentless. Patients, many of whom showed no signs of mental illness, were forced to sit for hours in freezing temperatures. They were denied basic hygiene. They were fed spoiled food and dirty water. Nurses screamed at them, beat them, and tied them down with wet sheets until their bodies went numb. And all of it happened behind the tall stone walls of an institution that claimed to offer healing. Bly saw women punished for crying, for praying, for asking to see family. One woman was there simply because she didn't speak English and was assumed to be mad. Another had been dumped by her husband and committed out of convenience. Their lives were treated like refuse, hidden from the world, forgotten. The staff operated with impunity, and the doctors rarely listened. To be inside that asylum was to be erased. She watched women's spirits break. Intelligent, vibrant women became silent within days. The constant cruelty, the icy baths, the hunger, the yelling, it wore them down until they could no longer fight. Bly later wrote that a perfectly healthy woman could be made insane simply by enduring the so-called treatment. Her reporting revealed something even more chilling. There was no way out. Once labeled insane, a woman's voice was stripped of credibility. If she protested, she was combative. If she wept, she was hysterical. Even showing signs of normalcy became suspicious. It was a trap with no exit, and the more rational she acted, the deeper she sank into confinement. She described the daily torment not in sensational terms, but in heartbreaking details. The spoiled oatmeal that smelled of sour paste, the straw mattresses soaked in urine, the silence forced on women who dared to complain, and all the while visitors and donors toured the facility, shown only the clean hallways, the smiling attendants, the rehearsed scenes of compassion. After 10 days, Pulitzer's paper sent a lawyer to secure her release. Bly emerged from the asylum with notes, memories, and testimony that shook the public. When her article was published, readers were horrified. The government launched an investigation. Conditions at Blackwell's Island began to change. Funding was increased. Some of the worst staff were fired. All because one young woman had dared to descend into darkness and tell the world what she saw. But Nellie Bly's courage went beyond her willingness to risk her safety. She exposed a truth that society had long refused to face, that women's pain was often dismissed, their voices silenced, and their autonomy stolen under the banner of care. She showed how institutions designed to help could be warped into machines of suffering, and how easily someone could fall inside them. Her work ignited the field of investigative journalism and laid the foundation for undercover reporting. But more than that, it gave voice to the voiceless. Her expose was not just about broken walls or moldy bread. It was about dignity, about seeing people who had been made invisible, about refusing to let their pain be buried beneath polite society's blind eye. Bly would go on to cover major stories around the globe, from factories to war zones, but 10 Days in a Madhouse remained her defining act of defiance. Even today, her story remains a stark warning about how institutions can fail, about how power, when left unchecked, can turn caretakers into jailers, and about how sanity itself can be a fragile, manipulated concept in the hands of those who control the narrative. Nellie Bly didn't just change journalism. She changed lives. Her courage opened locked doors, both literal and symbolic. She walked into a nightmare so others wouldn't have to. And her voice, echoing from the pages of history, still demands that we listen, not just to the past, but to those today who are still fighting to be heard. Why married women had no legal right to refuse treatment. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed, groggy and disoriented, only to discover that your body has been altered. Without your knowledge, without your consent, and with no legal recourse. This was not a nightmare. For married women in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this was a reality sanctioned by law. Across many Western countries, a husband had full legal authority to make medical decisions for his wife, including institutionalization, forced surgery, or experimental treatments, without her approval or even her awareness. The roots of this brutal reality lie in a doctrine known as coverture. Under English common law, when a woman married, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She ceased to be an individual under the law. She could not own property, sign contracts, or testify in court. Her body was no longer fully her own. Her autonomy, social, financial, and physical, was erased by marriage vows. This legal framework traveled across the British Empire and influenced laws in America, Canada, Australia, and beyond. Doctors, too, were complicit. Medical ethics of the time did not prioritize patient autonomy, especially not for women. Surgeons routinely performed hysterectomies, mastectomies, or institutional commitments based on a husband's permission alone. In many cases, women were not even informed. A husband could claim his wife was hysterical, and she might be admitted to an asylum the next day. The burden of proof was minimal. The consequences were lifelong. One of the most harrowing examples is found in the case of surgical sterilizations. As the eugenics movement gained traction in the early 20th century, women deemed unfit or morally questionable were sterilized, often at the request of their husbands or fathers. Consent was considered irrelevant. These were not isolated incidents. They were public policy, upheld by courts, and defended by science. And while this reality seems unthinkable today, the laws that allowed it persisted well into the 20th century. In the United States, it wasn't until the 1970s that women began to gain the legal right to refuse medical procedures independently of their husbands. Before that, even access to birth control could be denied if a husband disapproved. In Britain, laws shifted more slowly, with medical consent rights lagging behind broader civil rights reforms. The psychological toll of these injustices is immeasurable. Many women suffered in silence, trapped between their doctor's authority and their husband's control. Those who protested were often labeled difficult, unstable, or insane. Their words were dismissed, their pain medicalized, and their autonomy crushed beneath a system that considered female bodies a matter of male stewardship. Feminist writers and reformers began to push back. Women like Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female doctor in the U.S., and campaigners for suffrage linked political disenfranchisement to medical abuse. They argued that without bodily autonomy, women could never be truly free. Their work laid the groundwork for modern consent laws and the bioethics movement. In France, under the Napoleonic Code, a married woman was legally incapacitated, on par with children and criminals. She could not open a bank account, sign a lease, or even visit a doctor without her husband's permission. In Germany, similar laws prevailed. Across the Western world, womanhood and marriage became synonymous with legal dependency, where personal agency was systematically stripped in the name of propriety and order. The justification was always the same. Women were believed to be too emotional, too irrational, or too fragile to make informed decisions about their health. The paternalistic medical establishment and patriarchal legal system fed off each other. Doctors consulted husbands, not wives. Surgeons asked for signatures not from patients, but from the men who claimed them. A woman's silence was seen not as absence of consent, but as proof she did not need to be asked. This wasn't just theory, it was practice. Countless women were institutionalized for minor infractions, reading too much, resisting sexual advances, grieving too long. In the United States, asylum records from the 1800s include reasons for commitment like nervous temperament, religious excitement, or simply disobedience. In each case, it was a man, usually a husband, who signed the paper. And once inside, women lost the right to contest their confinement. In 1915, a woman in New York was committed by her husband after she refused to undergo surgery for uterine fibroids. She begged for a second opinion. Instead, she was sedated, operated on, and when complications arose, declared insane from post-operative hysteria. The doctor later admitted under oath that he never spoke to her directly. He never saw the need. Cases like these fueled early feminist outrage. Activists demanded not just voting rights, but medical sovereignty. They campaigned for laws requiring informed consent, legal protections against forced institutionalization, and the right for women to access contraception and abortion without spousal approval. Progress came slowly. The 1960s and 70s saw landmark legal victories in women's health care rights, but often only after years of lawsuits, protests, and public scandal. Informed consent laws were rewritten, bioethics boards were created, and medical schools began to include gender studies in their training. Yet even now, echoes of that dark legacy remain. Women, especially women of color, the disabled, and those with mental health diagnoses, still report being dismissed by doctors, denied pain relief, or coerced into procedures. In some countries, spousal consent for medical treatment is still required. The fight for bodily autonomy is far from over. History shows us that the denial of medical consent to married women was not a medical necessity. It was a legal weapon, a tool of silence wielded with precision. It was used to punish, to control, and to erase. And for too long, it worked. But the resistance was fierce, and it left behind not just stories of survival, but blueprints for change. To understand that era is to understand the cost of being unheard and the power of reclaiming the right to say no.